All right, I think that's 1:30, so we'll make a start. Firstly, just good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us on this side panel on investing in safe land, practical pathways to support livelihood systems in the Horn of Africa. I'm Becky Wicks, the Deputy Regional Director for HALO in Africa, and it's a real pleasure to be here with you all and with such a strong panel here today. Now, before we get to the discussion, I just want to take a moment to set the scene. Because when we talk about mine action, we often talk about it in technical terms. Square meters cleared, items destroyed, beneficiaries reached. But for the communities we work with, the impact is much more immediate and much more personal. One of our colleagues, Hassan Kossa, or who goes by HK, he's our operations manager in Somalia. And by day, he's out in the minefields, and by night, he's this extraordinary poet. And he's worked in mine action for decades across Somalia and Somaliland, and he can't be here with us today, so I really want to bring some of his words and stories into this discussion. In one of his poems, he describes explosive remnants of war like this. They are scattered, beautiful and attractive, as though they are Eid presents. And that captures something very real. These are objects that sit in farmland, along roads, near water points, and around the places where people live and work. They can look harmless, attractive even, but they shape daily life. And this is not something from the past. As recently as last week, 2 children in Somaliland were severely injured after picking up explosive ordnance while herding livestock. So this is not theoretical, it is current, and it is shaping how people live every day. And that brings me to the core point that we all want to make today. In the Horn of Africa, safe land is not just about removing risk. Safe land is what makes livelihoods possible. If land is not safe, people cannot graze livestock, they cannot farm, they cannot move, and they cannot access markets. And in a region where livelihoods depend so directly on land, water, and movement, that has far-reaching consequences. And that is exactly why I'm pleased this discussion brings together partners working across the region. So just before I introduce the panel, I think it's worth noting that this discussion also reflects a really important partnership in practice. HALO, Danish Refugee Council, and Humanitarian Inclusion are part of a 3-INGO consortium working together under GFFO funding across Ethiopia and Sudan. What is particularly valuable about today's panel is that it mirrors that collaborative approach. Across our presentations, we'll give a spread of mine action work across the Horn of Africa, drawing on different operational contexts, but looking at a shared question: how safe land supports livelihoods, recovery, and resilience. Now, whilst HALO does work across Sudan and Ethiopia, for my presentation, I'm going to focus on Somalia and Somaliland. Emily Christie will then build on that, particularly looking at the environmental and land restoration dimensions. We'll then move to Sudan with Catherine Nelson from DRC, and Simon Elmont will speak to HI's work in Ethiopia and Sudan as well. So together, we hope to give a fuller picture of how mine action connects to livelihoods across the region. Perfect. So in my presentation, I'll focus on 3 areas: pastoral systems, trade corridors, and small-scale agriculture. Now, HALO's been working in Somaliland and Somalia since 1999 and 2015, respectively. And so I want to bring each of these to life with examples from the field. Starting with pastoral systems. So in the Horn of Africa, livelihoods depend on movement. Pastoralists don't rely on one fixed piece of land. They rely on access to a wider landscape, moving between pasture, water, and seasonal resources. So when contamination blocks access, it is not just land that is lost. It is movement, it is grazing, it is water, and it is resilience. We see this very clearly in Inaguha, where this picture is, a pastoralist community near the Somaliland-Ethiopia border. For nearly 5 decades, the community lived with landmines around them. And we interviewed the village leader, Abdi Rahman, in 2025, who described how the mines killed 4 people, including children, injured another man, killed livestock, and forced children to take long detours to school because the school itself had once sat inside that very same minefield. He said, "The landmine stopped us from collecting water from the Burkad. We were completely surrounded." That is what contamination looks like in a pastoral system. It cuts people off from water, grazing routes, and ordinary movement. Between 2020 and 2025, Halo cleared nearly 1 million square metres there and destroyed 130 items of explosive ordnance, of which 95 were anti-personnel mines and 7 were anti-vehicle mines. And when the land was released in July 2025, the change was immediate. One farmer and pastoralist, Ahmed, we spoke to, he said, "It felt as if an enemy was living here. Everyone lived in panic, but now we move and walk freely." And that phrase is really the point of this slide. Now we move and walk freely. Because safe land in pastoral areas is not just about safety, it is about restoring movement. And that access comes at a critical time. According to IPC, between July and September 2025, around 3% of the population in Somalia, which is 624,000 people, have been experiencing emergency levels of acute food insecurity, while more than 15%, which is 2.8 million people, have been experiencing crisis levels of food insecurity. So this is not just clearance, it is the restoration of pastoral livelihoods in climate-stressed environments. The second area is trade corridors. And this is where I think we need to widen how we talk about mine action. Because in the Horn of Africa, trade is not abstract, it is physical, it is movement, it is roads, feeder routes, border crossings, grazing access, and the safe passage of people, livestock, and goods. The Berber Corridor is one of the clearest examples of that. It connects Addis Ababa to Berber Port and is central to Somaliland's livestock economy. Between 2011 and 2015, approximately 16.8 million livestock were exported through Berber Port, and around 70% of Somaliland's population relies on climate-sensitive agriculture and pastoralism. So safe access to those routes matters not just for commerce, but for livelihoods. And contamination continues to interfere with that system. Halo's recorded 25 human, vehicle, and animal accidents and around 554 mines within 100 metres of the Berber Corridor. And during my time as programme manager in Somaliland, from April 2024 to December 2025, we had 3 mine accidents along this very same corridor, one of which involved the mayor of Hargeisa, who drove over an anti-personnel mine just 100 metres away from a current minefield that Halo is still clearing today. And this is where I want to bring this to life. This is Ariambo, about 40 minutes outside Hargeisa, directly alongside the Berber Corridor. What's striking in Ariambo is what happens during clearance. As soon as Halo clears a part of the minefield and moves forward, people move straight in behind. They cultivate the land, they're bringing livestock back. There is no waiting. And in that same town, land that was once a minefield is now this school. One teacher we spoke to following clearance said life was so hard that neither human beings nor livestock were allowed access to this area. The village head explained that before Halo cleared the site, children had to travel 10 kilometres to the next village to go to school. And after clearance, the first school in the community was established on that ground. And what I like most about this story is that it doesn't stop just at the building of the school. One of the teachers there now, Omar, was among one of the first pupils to study at the school after it opened. He later went on to study public health in Hargeisa and now returns to volunteer there 5 days a week. He said, "It feels like I've got the chance to give back the favour to my students and my school, since this school and its teachers were behind my success." And another teacher, which is Idris, who's pictured here, he put it even more simply, "Without education, there is no light." And that is the longer-term impact of clearance. Not just a safe site, a school, but not just a school, a teacher, and not just a teacher, but a community investing back into itself. And the third and final area is small-scale agriculture. This is where we have some of the clearest household level evidence. In Somalia, Halo's household data showed that 95% of surveyed households reported improved access to agricultural, grazing, or residential land after clearance. 60% reported improved access to water, 60% reported increased livestock income, and 60% reported increased crop income. That's important because it shows that clearance changes behaviour as well as access. People plant, people invest, and people use the land that they had previously feared. And we are increasingly seeing that clearance alone is not always enough, that it's not just about making the land safe, but usable and sustainable. Now, Emily's going to talk about this in much more depth, but I just wanted to reiterate that message. Safe land can become productive land when we support the transition properly. And sometimes the reality is even more direct. In Beledweyne, a farmer took the risk of ploughing contaminated land himself. He knew the danger, and he knew it was a minefield. He hit a mine and then destroyed his tractor. So why did he do it? Because the safe area he still had was no longer enough to feed his family. His children had grown up, married, and had families of their own, and the remaining land was not enough. Halo cleared that land and destroyed 4 anti-vehicle mines and handed that land back to the family. And that story matters because it tells us something uncomfortable but important. People are not waiting for perfect safety before they try to survive. They're already taking the risks. So across all these examples, we see the same pattern. Mine action enables movement, trade, agriculture, and it enables recovery. It is not a standalone activity. It is part of how livelihoods function. And what I've focused on so far is how safe land unlocks that access. Emily is now going to build on this, looking more closely at what happens next, particularly how land is restored and used sustainably over time. So with that, I will pass to Emily from Halo. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Becky. Thank you. So as Becky noted, I'm going to go into a little bit more of the granular detail on some of our post-clearance land use support in the region. But before I do that, I just want to kind of bring it back to the Halo Trust's broader strategy when it comes to how we look at what the outcomes or desired outcomes of our clearance activities are. So the Halo's strategy for 2025 to 2028, so our mission remains the same as it has for a long time, but under the strategic objectives here, if I just show you, so we've obviously got the kind of protection of people, which is really looking at clearance itself and clearance outcomes. And then down here we've got the strengthening of security, which is more about weapons and ammunition management. But key to this strategy is we've also got the restoration of communities. So that strategic objective is really focused on the economic development of places post-clearance and on the environmental and food security outcomes of the clearance process itself. So to bring it to kind of another but equally relevant strategic level, we've also got the IMAS standard 713, quite a recently rewritten IMAS standard on environmental management and climate change in mine action. And it's quite a comprehensive document, so I've kind of cherry-picked a few key clauses here. Which really inform our approach at the moment in Horn of Africa, which is one of the regions in which we've really been kind of rolling out this standard and understanding the work we do within the framework of it. So to draw your attention to just a couple, you've got the ensuring that operators are obliged to ensure that planning and operations support local adaptation or mitigation strategies. So that's quite a shift away from what the kind of strategic objective was framed as before this standard was published. And it really means that we have to understand the climate conditions and the kind of longer term impacts of explosive ordnance for the communities that we work with and amongst in order to make sure that we do support those adaptation and mitigations as opposed to possibly inadvertently harming them. And then, I won't go through all of these, but also I would just kind of highlight giving particular attention to the environmental conditions required for subsistence or economic purposes and to ensure that those activities can continue post-clearance. So that's really important for the context that we find ourselves working in. I'm going to be talking, as Becky did, largely about Somaliland and Somalia, the areas that we work there. So just to kind of highlight how the issues that we've come across or that communities face in those areas link back into these broader strategic frameworks. So in the areas where HALO's working, in Somaliland in particular, the degradation of rangelands is already a known problem. There's a lot of research supporting the fact that this is an issue that communities face on a daily basis. And there are multiple different reasons behind this. So on the one hand, you've got grazing pressures, you've got climatic shifts, you've got increasing prolonged periods of drought, but you've also got the impact of legacy mine contamination, which might be area denial, it might be direct degradation, and you've got the impact of the clearance process itself, and in particular when mechanical clearance assets are used. So again, these are issues that we've kind of noticed over a long time. Our project's been going on since 2021, post-clearance support, but now we do have a kind of more of a framework to work them into with the revised IMS standard, and I'll loop back again to that at the end of the presentation. So just to kind of give you an idea of what we mean when we say post-clearance support, so this is an aerial shot of one of HALO's restoration sites in Nasir, up near the Ethiopian border in Somaliland. And what you're looking at here is basically the entire area is a cleared minefield, and we've got extensive soil works around the perimeter here. So these are a series of bunds and soil pits, the purpose of which is to slow the runoff of surface water when it does rain, when the limited rainfall does occur, and to increase percolation of that water. So essentially it's a moisture retention device. This is not something that we've come up with or that our partners on the ground have come up with. It's an established methodology. It's endorsed by the Somaliland Ministry of Environment and Climate Change. So what we're really doing here is acting as facilitators and enablers and recognising that there are impacts also from our own work that can be remediated through these activities. And then in the centre here, which you can see is very visibly a lot more green than the surrounding areas in this area photograph, you've got an enclosed area. So this area will be managed by the local community, set up by the local community, and at the cessation of mine action activities, it'll be managed continuously by that community, basically to provide them with dry season fodder for pastoral communities. And in parallel to that, but an important one to note, so in parallel with that, we're also supporting rehabilitation of community water storage areas. And again, there's a direct link between the degradation of these areas and our kind of core mandate as mine action organisations. A lot of the facilities were destroyed during the conflict in the 80s, but a lot of them slowly degraded over time afterwards because access to them was blocked by the mine threat. So again, we see supporting communities in restoring these facilities as really kind of key to our core mandate as well. We found in our area of operations in Somaliland, 50% of historically used community water storage areas were completely non-functional. So it's a widespread problem. And then just one more satellite image to really demonstrate how this work has evolved. So what you're looking at here is an area where we have our restoration and rehabilitation work going on in parallel with our clearance activities. So in the red polygons down at the bottom here, this is where there's active mine clearance operations being undertaken. And then these other two polygons of the same minefield, they're in the cleared area, and they're where restoration work has already started in parallel in the same time span as clearance activities. So there are multiple benefits to this. One main one is the cost effectiveness of this kind of strategy. So we've already got the assets on site, including mechanical assets, we've got the people on site, we've got our own staff, and it also enables us to include our own staff in these activities, our own staff being people who come from those communities and who can learn the skills and continue to deploy them once the mine action activities have come to an end. So the achievements of this project to date, I won't read out all of these, but to kind of summarise, so So far, and this is since 2021, HALO has rehabilitated 329 hectares in Somaliland. Now, this is a great statistic, but it is a fraction of the areas where we work, and this is something that we're really hoping to expand upon going forward and to kind of formalise our approach to making sure that areas are identified at the point of ideally survey, and then prioritise for these kind of activities at the request of local communities. And just to kind of come back to the impact, so this is that same site in Nasia from the original slide, and it's just a photograph. You can clearly see it's a very kind of visually arresting impact between the areas within the enclosure and outside of the enclosure. And that impact is replicated in the areas outside of the enclosure, but with the soil retention works. And the feedback from local communities has been incredibly positive here. We had at this site one elder who had been living in this area for decades, and he said that they found a resurgence of native grass species within this enclosure that hadn't been seen for about 20 years. So that's really positive, but we also have the use of it. So 2024, 2025, we experienced another period of drought, and this enclosed area was used by the local community. They basically stockpiled the outputs from that enclosure and shared it amongst the 200 most vulnerable, most food insecure families. And we've also had local university students visiting. It's been used as a demonstration site for anybody who's interested from surrounding communities. So I'll just talk very briefly about the next steps here. So what this whole process has taught us as an organisation is that whilst these measures are effective and they can be very cost efficient when they're employed adjacent to the mine clearance process, there is a need to identify the issues early, and there's also a requirement for the actual activities themselves to really be driven by those communities themselves. So for that reason, we've put together a pre-clearance assessment tool, which is very specific to the Horn of Africa, and it's a community-led tool, so it basically relies on community-level mapping, and the community coming together over several different sessions and identifying where would be their priorities for this to happen, pre-clearance, and what kind of activities would be appropriate to a particular context. So again, this kind of links back to making sure that whilst we're applying our own strategic frameworks and the international strategic frameworks, the actual activities on the ground are being driven and ultimately managed by the local communities. And just kind of the takeaway message from this, so the key learning point really is that food security and livelihood outcomes of mine action are not necessarily a given. Sometimes it's not sufficient just to conduct clearance itself, but in certain cases the entire historical legacy of that explosive ordnance contamination, including the environmental aspects, have to be addressed. And then just in brief, I kind of bring this back to our organisational approach to ensuring that these strategic frameworks feed into practical applied projects on the ground. So this is HALO's global environmental management system, and you'll see we've got our own internal policy up here alongside the IMAS standard 713, and this feeds into some internal documentation, SOPs and strategic frameworks for programs and mine action programs to follow. However, the actual activities on the ground are not driven by global SOPs or global frameworks. They're driven by program-developed environmental management plans, which are informed by the national environmental legislation and policies. So this is really a way of making sure that programs have got the autonomy to make sure that their activities are shaped by those contexts and driven by the communities that we work within. And then programs themselves will shape all of these various outputs at the bottom, which are kind of standard aspects of an environmental management plan. So I'll stop there. I don't want to take too much time. But please do come up afterwards if you'd like to hear a bit more about this process, or ask a question if we've got enough time for questions at the end. So thank you very much.
Hello? Does that work? No? Okay. Thanks a lot, Emily and Becky, I think, for that roadmap, which is really useful, I think, in the context of Sudan to see sort of where we might go, but it's not really where we are now in the sector. So I'm Katie. I'm the head of Humanitarian Mine Action for DRC Sudan. I'm not the country director, but I'm gonna talk a little bit about the Sudan context, where DRC has been working on mine action since 2022. Yes, that's me. And where the conflict itself is a direct driver of food insecurity, as is the contamination, and sometimes it can be a bit difficult to separate out the linkages between those things. So according to IPC projections for the current period, which is May-June 2026, and is also the beginning of the lean season in Sudan, 41% of people across the country are expected to be in crisis levels of food insecurity. So you can see in this map, which covers just an area in central Sudan where DRC works on mine action and in our other sectors, they are, almost all localities are in IPC level 3, which is crisis level or above, with just a couple of exceptions, and some localities that are even in emergency phase. And just this area represents over 7 million people that could be in crisis levels of food insecurity. And on top of that, these yellow dots that we've plotted are ACLED data on the use of explosive and remote violence, which we've tended in Sudan to use kind of as a proxy indicator for contamination, because it's really challenging in such an unstable context to actually have more accurate information about contamination. But it does tend to map onto what we've seen in terms of contamination in the country. So you can see that the high level of use of explosive weapons in these locations that are already experiencing extreme food security, often as a direct result of the conflict. And the explosive contamination itself is only prolonging the recovery process in areas that are now considered safe. So just a bit of background on Sudan. It's an agricultural nation with 2/3 of the population employed in the agricultural sector as farmers, fishers, herders, agro-processors, kind of throughout the value chain. And interestingly, as the other sectors have collapsed, as the war has gone on, agriculture has become increasingly important, particularly small-scale agriculture for people who have stayed in their homes and have not been displaced. However, while it's become more important, at the same time, the cultivated area has declined because of the conflict and the unsafe areas. And particularly in terms of irrigated agriculture, there's been a real decline. The International Food Production Research Institute, I think, survey has found, particularly in Greater Khartoum, that 3/4 of farmers have reported some type of conflict impact on their farms, and more than 1/3 are citing unexploded ordnance as preventing them from planting or being a risk when they're thinking about resuming cultivation. So I think, as I probably don't need to convince anyone in this room, even after the battles have ended, which they have largely in Khartoum in particular, explosive ordnance left behind from the conflict is continuing to impact the lives and livelihoods of people who are trying to resume their lives. And I think it's really important to highlight this, particularly in Sudan. Sudan has over 20 million people displaced, both inside and outside of the country. But since the kind of changing conflict lines in the country, more than 2.6 million people have been returning to this sort of central area that comprises Khartoum, Sennar, and Al Jazeera. About 40% of them have gone back to Khartoum, which is placing really severe pressure on these already very fragile livelihoods and really fragile food security situation, and also has put them into contact with unexploded ordnance. And indeed, more than half of the accident reports have been from Khartoum State since 2025. So I think the returns to Khartoum are particularly complicated as people are beginning to resume their livelihoods, and it's definitely bringing them into contact with new dangers. The presence of explosive restricts access to roads, markets, farming, and grazing land, which is limiting economic recovery efforts. And as I've said, while there isn't really comprehensive information on contamination in Sudan, there have been many reports of accidents resulting from people attempting to practice their livelihoods and coming into contact with unexploded ordnance in ways that are unfamiliar in the Sudan context, which is used to kind of a legacy landmine contamination situation, which no longer resembles the largely urban situation that we see now. So, for example, we're seeing pastoralists in some of these farming areas. They've done things like picked up hand grenades, thinking that they are scrap metal that could be used as bells for their cows, and people have lost limbs in the process. In the same state, in Al Jazeera, we had a couple of pastoralists and several donkeys killed or injured while trying to plow their fields to resume planting. And even fishermen along the Nile are pulling up their nets and finding unexploded ordnance when they're fishing. And I think, to kind of echo what Becky said earlier, we're seeing a lot of reports of people kind of continuing to pursue their livelihoods despite their knowledge of what they might be encountering, which is something we need to be aware of. There are reports of scrap metal collectors in particular in these urban areas who are actively traveling to battle sites to pick up scraps of metal because of the money they can earn for it. So, as you can see from this image, DRC and our partners are trying our best to reach these communities where they are and ensure that we're really targeting our risk education. In this case, we're traveling out into these more rural communities to reach farmers who are grazing their lands. And also you can see this image of an area where we have a big issue with scrap metal collection. So, I think I should start by saying that given the ongoing conflict context in Sudan, other than sort of this targeted risk education approach, efforts to systematically target mine action work towards food security outcomes in Sudan are definitely pretty nascent, but it's a direction that we really hope to go in. DRC has been conducting clearance in Khartoum and Jazeera states with local partners that encompasses the full range of activities from battle area clearance and building search to manual mine clearance. And we've found over 12,000 items of unexploded ordnance so far and cleared over 3 million square meters. So I'll share just a couple of examples of what we've done so far that illustrate, I think, both the type of the problem and what we hope can be the basis for more systematic prioritization. So in this case, we've located a minefield here that is proximate to the key highway that runs north-south through Khartoum. But as you can see from this Google Earth snapshot, hopefully, the town is over here and the farmland is over here. So farmers have been traveling through this minefield area. There's a road kind of along here in order to access their farms, which are here close to the river. And so even once we had teams there that were urging farmers not to pass through here, farmers were still crossing this area, and we didn't know at that point kind of how far the minefield extended north-south. But the farmers were still crossing to cultivate their fields because that's how they feed their families. And so one of the first priorities of the team was to clear an access road so that the farmers could safely walk adjacent to the minefields to get to their farms. And I think we need to recognize that in Sudan, this is both an urban and a rural issue. As you saw, in a rural area, no safe access means no farming. But this, I think, is even more challenging in an urban area because you have both an inability to practice urban household agriculture, but also you have the disruption of the food system in a place that's really reliant on importing crops from other areas. So this is an example of the local market in Omdurman, which is a historic market that is a real hub of commerce. And DRC and our partner teams conducted battle area clearance here and risk education so that traders would be able to resume. And it's now fully operational, which is great. So I'll close with just a few thoughts, maybe on what can be done next. So I think what we'd really like to see in Sudan, but again, it's at a pretty nascent phase, is a process whereby clearance prioritization takes agricultural productivity, displacement data, and protection risks into account, not only contamination data, to ensure that high-value food security targets like this market are prioritized. This prioritization process could then be followed by risk education and NTS in identified areas, and then followed up with clearance as needed. And then ideally by rehabilitation works of irrigation systems or provision of agricultural inputs. And DRC has an EU-funded project that will do just that starting in a couple of months. So hopefully I can be back in a year or two and report on more positive outcomes. And I think, again, it probably will not surprise anyone to hear that linking mine action with economic recovery interventions that support this infrastructure rehabilitation is critical in conflict-affected communities like Sudan, and we need donors and UN partners to recognize that and integrate mine action into these larger reconstruction projects that we're seeing. And then I think, as my final point, I'll just echo what Becky said, because I think it's really important, particularly in a conflict context like Sudan. I think we as a sector need to be realistic that until contaminated land can be cleared, there will continue to be a trade-off between an individual or a family's safety and their food security, between the risk of an explosion today or starvation tomorrow. And I think that we as a sector need to think a little bit more about what harm reduction might look like in a conflict context than we are willing to do so far. And I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
Hi everybody, can you hear me? All good? My name is Simon Almont and I'm a global land release specialist for HI. Part of my remit is to be the technical referent for our projects in East Africa, which is why I'm standing on stage today. And I just want to say at this point, it's a real pleasure to be sitting here with our consortia. It's something quite new for probably all of us to do what we're about to do at the scale that we're talking about, and that's 3 organisations working in 2 countries next to each other. So it's quite an unusual thing. So I'm very honoured to be here with all my colleagues here from Halo and DRC today. My job, as I said, I have technical responsibilities globally, but our 2 operations which are relevant today are Ethiopia, where we have an established programme that's been delivering land release activities in Tigray. That programme opened about 3 years ago. Ethiopia and Sudan are both quite difficult contexts to work in. We all know that. And so it's taken a little bit of time to get things going. But as we speak today, I've got 3 teams working, and in fact one of our teams is just doing a special project outside Addis, the request of the government, while the other 2 teams are carrying out battle area clearance and EOD spot tasks around Tigray, in Tigray, around Mekelle. Our programme in Sudan is in the process of opening. I first visited Sudan about 9 months ago to make an assessment as to whether HI could open a land release project there. For me, it was obvious that the needs were there, whether we could open or not, whether we could get funding were always the difficult parts. But as I say, I'm very happy now that with our consortia partners and with other funding, that the programme is now opening. And in fact, the chief operations and the first technical field manager are deploying in the next 10 days or so. So I hope to see some progress quite quickly when they start training our local partner. HI is a global actor. We work in nearly 60 countries with a focus on health, rehabilitation and AVR projects. So we are very much multi-mandated. But we have to ensure, as is our name, that inclusion is at the heart of everything we do. The subject of today's side event really frames our responses in both Ethiopia and Sudan and those contexts, with a focus on using land release as an enabler for those other projects. and those of the other actors across the humanitarian response. Using the H2H model, we are already making contact with organisations that are not active in the world of AVR but see the needs for us to assist them. Land release is therefore key to the reopening of services via access and route clearance, urban clearance, and returning agricultural areas to farmers and food producers so they can safely provide food security in local and extended areas. And I think that's where I wanted to focus today. We've had some really specialised focus points here from my colleagues. Mine is really about access and, excuse the pun, the grassroots of that. And you'll see with some photos that have taken recently and my explanation of how important access is to provide people the ability to get back to their livelihood. Oh, formatting's gone a bit awry. As I said, our Ethiopia programme is well established with 3 multitask teams covering a large area of intervention. For those of you who know Ethiopia, it takes an awful long time to get around. It's a massive country, and the infrastructure, certainly in the north, is not great with regards to roads and roofs. Our EOD spot task, prioritised by the 3 MTT, is designed to aid quick return of land. So small parcels of land which have been prioritised by the landowners, by the farmers, not by us. We've been to them, we've asked them what they want us to do, and they've identified very small areas and access routes between them. And this is because grazing and the movement of animals in Ethiopia is so important. After extended non-technical survey, the teams will further move into other modalities, battle area clearance and minefield clearance in a longer-term strategy. Now, this slide, this is what I was sort of mentioning. The picture on the left showing these shepherds moving up a road is what they've been doing for the last couple of years, because the picture on the right shows where they used to walk. So it's a very beautiful valley. This picture is taken from pretty much the same spot. I've just turned 90 degrees. And this was in January of this year. So you can see on the right there is the remnant of a trail. And up until 3 years ago, that trail had been used, well, according to the locals, for the last few hundred years, because it's a very well-established area where they move sheep and goats and donkeys from one area to another. When they were using it, they started to have the obvious problems. And when they discovered that there was contamination and reported it through various processes, we ended up doing a survey there and found that there was an anti-personnel minefield, lots of risk education to not just these guys but others, and now they've rerouted themselves. And the reason why this is so important is that the old route was about 4 kilometres to get from well to the fields where they wanted to self-irrigate for their animals. The new route is about 12 kilometres. So it changes their day somewhat, and it means that their whole lifestyle and the way that they are conducting their day-to-day life has had to change around that. It's now a focus for us to be able to do that, to clear that minefield, although the area is not yet assigned to us. Again, we have to take things quite slowly in Ethiopia with regards to how tasking is carried out. Our footprint in Tigray covers large areas very similar to this, and it's agricultural land crisscrossed with these important areas of access where animals have traditionally been moved from either water or grazing to other areas where there is water and grazing. And again, the formatting is gone. Our Sudan programme, as I said earlier, is a very new programme, just getting started. It will have an initial multitask team that will work through a local partner. But we have already received multiple requests for urban clearance in Khartoum when our colleagues from DRC are already working, but that problem is enormous, but also the surrounding areas. Conducting EOD spot tasks, again, will be a priority for us after consultation with both the national authority, but again with the local food producers and farmers and those working in agriculture, and most importantly in irrigation. Water is obviously a very valuable asset for agriculture, and the access to both rivers, waterways, canal systems, pumping systems, and the buildings that hold the irrigation piping, for instance, is very important. And that's also been flagged to us that it's a priority for the local population. Which leads me to this picture. It's a pretty nondescript picture of a very usual looking wall in this part of the world, but the obvious problem being a small pile of anti-tank mines. It was described to me that this building was new, and this was the new rear access to it, but actually this building is exactly what I just described. It's a building that's used to house irrigation systems. So for those of us who worked in Africa and the Middle East, you see these very long black and blue pipes that are sort of 12 meters long, and all the various connections and fittings that go with them, and the pumps and the pumping systems, the flanges, the valves, all of this stuff is stored, and it's stored in that building for this particular area. So as well as those 4 anti-tank mines being put near the rear access to this, there was also UXO around the front, and also a small pile of anti-personnel mines that had been left near the front door. So obviously the locals were very worried about accessing this, which then reduced down their ability to start conducting irrigation, which is needed to grow their crops. I apologise for the picture on the left. It's awful quality. But this is one of the hospitals in Sudan. I'm moving between countries here. But the picture on the right shows one of the access points to the considerable size of the compound where the hospital is, which got blocked off during conflict. And you can see quite clearly that there is battle damage on those buildings. So there is obviously a potential problem with contamination. The picture on the left, completely out of focus, but it did show, because the piece has been cut off at the bottom, an anti-tank mine in the middle of the road. And this was the access road just past that access point into the hospital. So again, once the hospital is started to be refurbished, which I believe that is now in process, the access roads, both for the teams going in to carry out the refurbishment, but then also for the teams who wanted to start using parts of the hospital, have obviously got to be cleared. And when I said earlier that HI is a multi-mandated organisation, because we carry out rehabilitation, we need that building cleared quite quickly so we can set up our rehab project there, which is still being set up in another part of the country, but we want to move into the middle of Khartoum. Lastly, a picture of quite a large airdrop weapon. Again, I apologise, the formatting's gone weird. And this is near a presently disused fuel storage facility in Mekelle. It's on the edge of the town and actually very close to the airport. But again, a large fuel storage facility in the capital of this area is extremely important for both people working in the storage facility, but also the supply of fuel. Now, fuel is a problem everywhere in the world at the moment. Storage facilities are very important for bringing the fuel in so that the trucks can go back to get more. There is only 2 fuel storage areas in the whole of Tigray of that size. This one is not being able to use because there is that and 3 other airdrop weapons outside it. So there is now 3 guards in the facility, and we are negotiating with the government to be able to remove these. But again, things take a little time tasking in Ethiopia. So we're really canvassing to get that quickly so that the government can start moving fuel back. That's it from me. Short and sweet. Thank you.
Just want to say a huge thank you to the panellists for their contributions today. That was fantastic. And we've got about 10 minutes before the end of our session, so we'd like to open that up for Q&A. If anyone has any comments, any questions that they would like. Yes, please.
Yeah, good afternoon. Fran O'Grady, Chief UNMAS in Somalia. Thanks to all the panel for a very interesting presentation and the good work that your organisations are doing in the Horn of Africa. Glad to see HK's quote on the top. I had at the start of the presentation. We know him well, and I have his poetry book too. Yeah, I think it's more of a comment than a question, and I think that right now a lot of mine action in Somalia has fallen off. Humanitarian mine action and funding for it's fallen off the radar with competing global demands. So it's good to see events like this that will continue to highlight that. In Somalia, there's a much more need for NGOs on the ground, and I'm aware that Halo Trust has been there for a decade doing some important work, but there's need and space for much more. And this is in the context of a Somalia where the prominent explosive threat is improvised explosive devices. And I think it's important to keep that in our narrative as well when we're giving presentations as well, because in Somalia it accounts for 10 times the amount of civilian casualties is actually improvised explosive devices. And I think that once these get cleared, once the access is more permissive, the need for the work that you're doing will increase, because the access for people to go in and do this important work will increase. But I just want to say thank you and to acknowledge it, and just to highlight the importance that we collectively keep this on the radar. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I just want to comment, yeah, I am in agreement. It's one of those, it's not enough focus maybe is on Somalia. As you say, it gets pulled in lots of different directions, lots of need worldwide, but the need is still very much there. So yeah, thank you for your comment. Sorry, yes, please.
Thanks, everyone, for some really interesting presentations. I'm Christina Green. I'm a researcher at the University of Arizona. And one of the points mentioned in this morning's plenary was the fact that we have to report beyond meters squared, cleared. What have been some of the challenges in reporting on livelihood outcomes in your projects?
Would you like to take that?
Or successes?
Sorry? Yeah. Okay.
Great question. Thanks, Christina. Yeah, so there certainly have been challenges in how we report on those livelihood outcomes. I think historically the sector has, as you know, been very much focused on kind of meters squared and lives and limbs saved, which is obviously of a high importance, but those livelihood outcomes, especially if we talk in terms of kind of food security and access, are hugely challenging. I don't have the answer as such, because it's something that we're definitely still working through as our own projects develop. But I think when it comes to quantifying access to markets, that is certainly something that we can look at. The challenge remains in extracting kind of what degree of mine action activities are responsible for that, when there's bound to be kind of parallel processes happening. But I think we still can have kind of meaningful outputs in that direction. For us, specifically talking about the kind of rangeland rehabilitation projects that we have, and again, we did a little bit kind of learn as we went as to what would be really good indicators for tracking the positive outcomes of those projects. But the use of those areas post-clearance in times of need is really a kind of way that we found of concretely, tangibly measuring. So I threw up one statistic, but quite briefly. So in one of the project sites, for example, the local community who's now managing that site got together over the last couple of years when they had periods of drought, and they assigned the most kind of food insecure people within their communities access into that area so that they could feed their livestock during those drought periods. So for those very, very specific one, that's a very strong indicator for us in terms of use of those areas in times of need as identified by the communities who are managing it. But be very interested to hear the rest of the panel's thoughts.
I think I'd echo everything you say, and again, I think that's the direction we hope to move, but I think our mine action work in Sudan at the moment is very much in emergency response mode, and I think we're sort of just quickly moving on to the next task, and we're not doing as much as we should be doing to follow up on tasks. We just have these sort of anecdotal examples of an individual market or an individual area of farmland that we then can kind of see the impact on a couple of months later. And so I think that's why it's a good challenge to us. DRC, I think, sort of has no excuse as a multi-sector organization that does do economic recovery. I think it's something that we're looking at is just kind of automatically linking that in with our mine action to ensure that building in that monitoring and evaluation system is just part of what we're doing systematically. But yeah, for now, very, very nascent.
This one works, I hope. It's a really good question, and I think there's a huge amount of work to be done on how we can measure. I go back 15 odd years to when we responded in Libya. So I think I'm right in saying it was 2012. I can remember we were clearing strip farms, and there was, I can't remember who, but there was a university that came in and decided that they were going to record and report weight. So it was purely done on the weight of food that was produced, and we did it over a 3-year period, and obviously it was a form of indicator. I've not really seen much since about how else to record, but I think that's an interesting way that you can potentially look, because, you know, 1 year, because the land is contaminated, there's going to be no crop or very little crop grown. Once the land is cleared, then there obviously is. Different crops produce a different amount or different quantity of whatever it is they're growing, whether it's grain or cotton or potatoes or whatever. But I think there's different ways it could be looked at. I'd welcome to hear your ideas, but all I can think back in historic terms is that's what was being done in Libya 13 years ago.
Brilliant, thank you. And just to kind of echo on that, obviously it's something that we are looking at as a sector, but Halo, we use a lot of like household surveys where we do pre-clearance surveys where we're looking at like income from crop yield, access to water sources, to roads, like those statistics that I put up on the slide earlier. So that is one way to kind of look at the outcome as well, because then we go back 6 months later, a year later, to the same households to ask those same questions and to see the difference between that. But thank you so much for your question. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you for the presentations. My name is Igor. I'm with the GICHD. My question is maybe a little bit unusual, is this land restoration, rehabilitation, and livelihood support projects, how they are typically financed? Are they coming from typical donor financing, or there is another financing stream? And my next question is, if these projects are allowing for economic recovery of the regions, do you see potential room for private investments coming in to support those agricultural projects and development ones? Thanks.
Thank you.
Great questions, thank you very much. Yeah, so I can only speak on Halo's behalf here, and then maybe my colleagues can talk for the other organisations. I had on one of the slides, so we have counted on very generous support from the UK government, from the German Federal Foreign Office, and for continuation of those projects, we're looking at Norwegian funding as well. But we also, for those projects, have secured philanthropic funding. So we work, those projects in particular are funded by a private US-based philanthropic trust, which offers a degree of flexibility for starting up projects with the kind of intention of then integrating them into more established funding frameworks. So it's not a kind of sustainable long-term approach to funding. when it comes to sustainable and long-term, on the one hand, of course, is integrating it into our kind of standard existing frameworks, but the reality is that then your clearance is coming at an increased cost alongside the improved outcomes for beneficiaries of that process. So the kind of final thing that you mentioned when it comes to private investment, I know there have been lots of conversations about that in the sector. It is something that we'd be very keen to continue the conversation about, but it's not a model that we currently have employed for those kinds of projects, but maybe others have more context on that.
No, nothing to add, I'm afraid.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Oh, sorry. I'm conscious of time, so I will go to closing remarks, but would really encourage you to come find any of us after this discussion. If you have any other questions, we'd love to hear from you and to answer any of those questions that you have. So again, just wanted to say thank you to the panelists so much for all of your contributions today and to the questions. And I'm sorry that it was shorter than we'd hoped, but yeah, please come find us. We've heard from contexts across the Horn of Africa, from Somalia, Somaliland, Ethiopia and Sudan. And it's just great, whilst the context is so different, the pattern is very much the same. Contamination doesn't just sit in the ground. It shapes how people move, how people earn a living, and what's possible for communities over time. So we've also heard that the work is not finished, though, as well. And in the Horn of Africa, contamination is still affecting people today, as we've heard, very much so in the areas that we're working. The demand for safe, usable land continues to grow, particularly as communities are facing climate pressure, displacement, and increasing pressure on livelihoods. So this is not just about what's been achieved, but it's about whether that progress can continue as well. So just want to say thank you very much for your time today, and have a lovely rest of your NDM. Thank you.